All right. Well, it's time. I wanted to give my thoughts on the current league situation, 319 update, all the changes and stuff that everybody's been talking about, and kind of just consolidate a lot of the opinions I've had and things that I've talked about on stream, just kind of into one spot, just to have it there, and just go over everything, how I'm feeling about the league, how I'm feeling about a lot of the changes, and I think I've got a good list here. I think I was able to put together all the main points that have kind of sparked conversation or sparked kind of outrage, whatever it may be. But I just wanted to give my thoughts on it just for the sake of doing so. And so I'm going to be looking at each of these kind of individual sections here on their own, or at least trying to as much as possible, just to give them the most fair assessment of what they're going to be or what they should be without keeping in or without taking into account other outside factors like looking at, loot drops and the loot changes. I don't think it's fair to take into account the fact that, uniques specifically were nerfed in drop rate as like some sort of part of the loot overall, and just things like that. And I'm also going to hopefully avoid putting in any sort of like assumptions on specific numbers of stuff that we don't know, or at least I don't know personally the exact numbers on, because I think there's been way too much kind of parroted either misinformation or unproven information on like specifics of certain things that have changed, and I just don't think there's a point to any of it. But with that started, I'm gonna get through this list here. The first thing being the Archnemesis changes. So I've talked a lot since Archnemesis went core last league that I do firmly believe overall that Archnemesis as a rare mob, just it's how rare mobs are as a system in terms of the actual combat and gameplay and all that stuff, putting aside the rewards entirely, I do think it has the capabilities of just being vastly superior than what we used to have, because what we used to have was almost entirely just getting stat checked by the rares. There wasn't really mechanics or anything. Archnemesis isn't perfect. There's still quite a bit of stat checking, mostly right now on the defensive stats on the mobs, which is getting a nerf soon. I don't think it's in the game yet. Um, but it's done a lot better in terms of adding like interesting mechanics to the mobs. It's done a lot better in, for the most part, giving you signaling cues at a glance on what mods a rare or magic pack has or might have. It does a lot better job of that, and I think it also, the abilities that the mobs get from their mods that are kind of the actual mechanics you have to interact with versus just like the stat ones. So like the things like magma barrier or toxic or whatever they may be are for the most part pretty well telegraphed, and you can kind of keep up with them. There's some exceptions. I wish there was a bit more audio cues specifically, or just more pronounced audio cues, but that's kind of my own personal preference. I'm real big fan of audio cue stuff, and like the old rare mobs, the volatile in particular. There was like 3 or 4 iterations of it, and the final one we had, I felt like was just such a good example of how to do one of those modifiers well, because you always knew the second you heard that sound effect when a rare mob died, you were ready. But I think the actual concept of Arch Nemesis is good. I think the current execution is not great, and it's actually at this point mostly related to the rewards in the current system. I think the mobs themselves are actually pretty fine once they put in their next nerf to the defensive modifier, specifically kind of overstacking the tankiness of the mobs. But the core concept for this league that they kind of tacked on to Arch Nemesis, or just, I shouldn't even say Arch Nemesis, that they tacked on to rare monsters is less rare monsters, harder rare monsters, better loot from rare monsters. Um, it's in concept great, love it. The game was definitely spamming with too many rare mobs. It was a problem. So if there's less of them, and you make them harder, so there's some actual like reactive gameplay in maps other than just as opposed to just blasting everything immediately, which you'll get your characters there eventually, right? Where you just kind of insta-giving everything if you're really min-maxing. But this part's good. I like it. However, the current system where they have chosen to kind of tie the rewards to specific modifiers doesn't work very well. The idea of having these like different kind of reward types where like sometimes you kill a rare and it just explodes into uniques or six sockets or whatever it may be is like that part's not bad. It's fine. I think it's yeah, I think it's fine. But the current system for it doesn't really have much of a correlation for risk versus reward. You don't really get better loot from Archnemesis mobs because you fought a harder mob. You get better loot because you just happen to hit some combination that works well. And that goes for both like just because you fight a 4 mod, which is the max amount of mods, rare mob, doesn't necessarily mean that that mob's even going to be harder than another mob right next to it of the same base type with 2 mods. But that one with 4 could just randomly give you, you know, 50 times the value of loot. And I think that's a problem. I think that it really should be much more tied to the mobs being harder having the main effect on the amount of loot they're going to give, especially if they're going to have these like specific loot explosions. And that's not an easy thing to do. I will be completely honest. It's because like especially when there's like defensive mods and stuff, it's really hard to specifically kind of just sort out, okay, these are the things that are easy, these are the things that are medium, these are the things that are hard, because it's going to differ for different builds. So it's not like it's not a super easy solution, but the current one just feels really kind of whack. And I mean, even in the most recent post today, I think Chris himself was like said, as an example of kind of a thing where like loot is, pretty good. Like, oh yeah, Magic Find groups are sometimes finding 50 divines off a single mob. Um, I think, and from what I've seen, most people agree, like, if you could have, after running 500 maps, one mob drops 50 divines, or instead, you know, you got 50 divines spread out evenly across 500 maps. The consistency is just the better way to do it. And again, for me, especially if you're actually tacking on the rewards to the mobs that are actually more challenging. And then the next thing here is just the defensive mod stacking, which is the current issue with Archnemesis, where you're still kind of getting stat checked. You're not like interacting with the mobs because they're harder. And this one is getting addressed. We'll see how it goes after the patch, so it's hard to say too much. But I think the big potential of Archnemesis is kind of pulling away from just getting outright stat checked by rares, especially getting stat checked because it has certain mods. Um, I personally would much rather have the rares be tankier as a baseline and then, pretty decently pulling back on the defensive mods, which I think they're just pulling back on the defensive mods and not even buffing the mobs. But it's a weird spot. And there's some other couple weird things, like specifically the Lightning Mirage Archnemesis Stormstrider's the name, where like, especially when the mobs get really tanky, that thing just spams the little mirages at you, and there's like no limit to how many it can spawn. There's like small issues like that, but we'll see how this one goes. Hopefully they get it more under control. And then finally for the bit of this one, so the kind of solutions, I have it in quotes here, that I think could start at least a discussion towards a better system for Archnemesis be things like some sort of difficulty rating for the mob, where you'd have to take like a huge pass through pretty much every individual mod and like just about every combination of mod. And instead of having like the rewards tied to specific modifiers, because the thing about that too is you don't really have control over which mods you find on mobs. It's like the fact that, specifically Solaris touched, I think, just drops a lot of currency. That doesn't really affect your gameplay. You can't actively seek out Solaris touch. The only exception is like I think Metamorph. You can kind of put some of the mods back together sometimes. But that's like its own side league content thing. It shouldn't be a core thing like rare mobs in general shouldn't be really considered around that. It should be the other way around. But so like if they could somehow put together difficulty ratings and like add a specific number value to each rare mob, and then if this rare mob has a value of 50, then so and so whatever subset of reward type outcomes, and they could use the same reward type outcomes, could just pick one of them at random, and then like you would possibly even end up in situations where there's a 3 mod rare that gives more loot than a 4 mod could have, because the 3 mod had like very synergistic combos, and like it could even be things like, oh, this thing has like triple Ellie mods on it, which if you're a pure Fizz build, cool, that's just free loot, but like because of the fact that if you were an Ellie build it would be really hard to deal with, it becomes more valuable. Or if you want to avoid stuff like that, something like having a few mod groups, I think this would be a really interesting way to go about it, and also solves mostly the issue of just like the stacking of defense mods a bit. Ones that I talked about on stream and kind of had some input from chat and stuff that we came up with was there'd be 3 main group tiers, and then the 4th group would be those like touched top tier mods where you only get them on the 4 mod rares anyway. They can kind of be their own separate thing. And honestly, those mods probably need to, like, the actual special attacks that go off probably need to be a bit more impactful to maybe up the justified difficulty for more loot. But you could have like an offensive mod group, which would be the kind of just damage, some mods for like damage stat increases, mostly things like probably like assassin comes to mind. Then the defensive mod groups, where it's mostly just resistances or whatever mitigation ones. And then the kind of mechanics mod group, the ones that actually like give the monsters new abilities, so things like magma barrier, like toxic, those ones. And then just if you just pick from one of each, and that would help solve the idea of stacking. When you get that mob that has like prismatic and storm strider, and it's just fully resisted up, and both of those mods don't really do much. Or not storm strider, storm weaver. Storm strider does have a mechanic, but and there's probably some small degree of this being done on Archnemesis mobs already. I would imagine there's some sort of things where like certain full combos aren't able to show up. I could be wrong, but maybe. And then finally, this would require get another like slight rework of kind of the mods themselves, but if they want these like big loot explosions specifically happening off of the big 4 mod rares, it needs to be the case that those 4 modded rares are actually consistently the toughest ones. Because as it stands right now, in my experience this league, most of the 4 mod rares don't feel any different from most of the 2 mod rares. And honestly, I don't think I've had any 4 mod rares, and I've seen probably like close to 20, if not more than 20, probably more than 20 4 mod rares. They are quite rare, but like I don't think I've seen a single one that's tankier than the tankiest 2 mod rare that I've fought, which is just really weird. Because it's like I'm fighting these really hard ones that only have 2 mods and they don't drop anything. And then I fight a 4 mod that doesn't do anything and I get 1,000 pieces of loot. So, in summary, Archnemesis, I like the concept. I like the combat a lot better. It's getting better each league. They've touched up on a lot of things. But the main thing missing is the risk versus reward in the loot rewards from it. Because it just really doesn't feel like you get better loot for fighting harder rares. You just get better loot mostly because you found the lucky rare. And I don't think that that's the way that it should be. Moving on. Next up, there's the loot drops, the just kind of general big topic for a lot of people, I think, here, which is mostly boils down to the like league mechanic loot. But first thing I wanted to go over with it was some kind of player mistakes that have been made a lot that I've seen, and this doesn't apply to like everybody talking about it, but it's enough, and it's something that's happened over the history of PoE a lot. It's not like a new thing in particular, but mistakes assessing kind of the current league's drops, and especially when it comes to currency. Another thing would be like maps, like how this is kind of the same vein of like every single league, there will be a post on the subreddit, basically every league without fail, with a bunch of people chiming in that map drops are nerfed. Every league without fail, map drops are nerfed, map drops are nerfed, map drops are nerfed. And almost every single time that's not the case, right? But this league, a big thing has been, besides the obvious like uniques and juiced and all that stuff, a lot of people getting to early maps and stuff were talking about the global loot drops in general being gutted, and like currency not dropping even in, you know, unjuiced maps. They didn't have league content, they didn't have anything. So in theory, it shouldn't have really been nerfed, because what we know is that league content for the most part is what got nerfed, and we know that unique items got nerfed in drops. So one thing that happens a lot is people not necessarily factoring in the current league mechanic into the equation, because especially early on, for the vast majority of the leagues over the past probably at least 3 years, the current league mechanic has been a generally big source of your overall currency when you're mapping. And this league especially, aside from Lake of Calandra being undertuned on loot on launch especially, it was also outside of maps. You just didn't even get anything from it in maps, so people will end up not even consciously, but comparing, you know, like last league's amount of alchemies they got to this league, when last league they were hitting a sentinel, and the sentinel alone was dropping more than what they're seeing in the map this league, because they're comparing last league plus its mechanic to this league plus no mechanic. And then another one this league in particular that's kind of a weird thing is, again, back to the alchemies, because this is one I saw a lot early on, was people specifically using alchemies as a sighting for kind of showing that loot had been nerfed and there's less like currency dropping. Like, another big thing to keep in mind is we knew before the league started that this was going to be the case. We aren't getting as many uniques to drop. That was like a big thing this league, is there's less uniques dropping overall. You're not getting just flooded with the low tier kind of vendor trash uniques. But those low tier vendor trash uniques were basically the biggest source of alchemies early in the league. So it's not like alchemies got gutted. It's not like you're not finding less alchemies. You're just not finding the uniques to vendor for the alchemies. But even with those kind of missed factors aside, there is obviously some real stuff to talk about. The big thing is the past league mechanic stuff. So they talked about, I don't know any of the specific numbers. I'm not going to pretend that I do. And I don't really play softcore trade, so I don't know a lot of the details of juicing in general, like the specific numbers on it. But we know that past league mechanics had a lot of quantity things nerfed, and overall it results in less loot, especially when you start stacking a lot of them up, which ends up coming from like delirium orbs and sextants and scarabs and stuff, which One thing I still haven't necessarily seen that kind of bothers me there is I know the post today was Chris admitting that he didn't even really realize what was happening with this change. He had just kind of given it the go ahead, and like it just the whole thing going through was a disaster. But I don't even really know if they were intending to make it so you get less loot on average for clearing a map, like overall. Obviously, if you're juicing way up and they do this nerf that, like that had to be the intention. But what was their exact intention with doing this? I'm not sure. Outside of the idea of outliers, which is they talked about like certain league mechanics just randomly giving way more loot than others is it's really not something that should be in the game. I don't think. Like I do agree with that in theory, in the concept, right? Like if there's two league mechanics that are just as hard as one another, and otherwise they're the same. They give like the roughly the same amount of XP value, but then one just gives 3 times the loot as the other. Why? Like that doesn't make sense because then the one that gives less is basically immediately invalidated, and there's no reason to do it. However, the thing that kind of I think got missed with this, I don't know the exact numbers on the reworks of the current quantity bonuses, but what it seems like has been missed, at least to me, is that all league mechanics are not created equally when it comes to difficulty, and some of them like might be outliers in loot, but they're also outliers in difficulty. Like Delirium specifically, from kind of the secondhand accounts that I've heard, is one of the ones that got hit pretty hard. But like high Delirium in maps is also way harder than just about every other previous league mechanic, so it probably should be quite a bit more rewarding, and it doesn't seem like that's the case. Again, I could be wrong here. Maybe it still is quite more rewarding by comparison, but I think it is a tough one there. And then the whole juice situation with like the full magic finding and stuff. I can't really talk on too much. It's hard to say. I know a lot of people posted like the MP videos and clips and all that, but like a lot of the loot filters that they're running for those are showing unique items specifically, and we know that unique items themselves got nerfed in drop rates, so it's just too hard to draw a real conclusion there. But I don't want them to kill juice for the softcore players that are really ramping their stuff up. I do think it's fair to kind of want to reel in certain previous league mechanics if they're just randomly giving way more loot for no more difficulty. Because at the end of the day, just like with Archnemesis, risk versus reward, I think, is the like king concept here. That should always be the top, priority with loot and stuff. If the content is harder, it should give more. That's just how it is, right? Then the last thing on the loot drops is them changing Magic Find to affect more aspects of loot in general, with kind of what we've seen with the Archnemesis, those like special loot drop types that they have, the special item conversions and all that. Historically, MF Magic Finding hasn't really affected like any of that stuff. It's basically always only been the actual base drops from the mobs. I mean I don't have a lot to say about this one either, but I think it's cool. I think it's cool that they're gonna potentially maybe be doing more of this where Magic Find affects more things of the game. If it's done in a way that like, it's not abusable where you can just bring in a Magic Find alt or something for some random thing at the end, and just as long as it doesn't make it mandatory for like certain content, because that's the dangerous point, especially in trade leagues. If there's like content that has like a cost to entry, and that content is scaled with Magic Find, then it will most likely become the case that the cost to entry goes up because of the profitability of the people magic finding it, and then the people who aren't magic finding it can basically no longer justify running it from a like cost to profit type perspective, which a lot of people are obviously very, that's like a very key thing that they care about. All right, next up, this is a fun one. Unique drops, unique items specifically. I've thought a lot about this one. I think this started, we're getting to the stuff that I've thought about a lot more. But uh the big thing with uniques this league, obviously they like reworked a bunch of uniques. That's not really part of what I'm going to be talking about here. The reworked uniques are cool. Handful of them are really, really good. But this is more specifically about the whole unique items dropping, where they lowered the amount of uniques that are dropping, and I think that's good for the most part. In most cases, the lower and mid tier uniques didn't need to be dropping as much as they were in a lot of cases. So having them a bit more exclusive and like kind of maintaining some value or like excitement even maybe when you find one is nice. Like just as like a random example, I found a Rise of the Phoenix on day 5 in hardcore trade, and it was the first one I'd found in the league. So anytime I find a unique that I haven't had this league yet, you know, I'll go check it on trade, see if it's worth anything. And I assumed it wasn't. I thought it was gonna be like a 1C thing. But when I looked it up, it was like, oh, this is actually like 6 or 7C, which isn't crazy. But it's like, oh, I actually found, you know, I can sell this. I can actually get some currency out of it. And then it turned out also that mine was really high rolled, and I was able to get even more. I think I got like 20C or something because it was like really, really well rolled. Which kind of goes into the Divines thing, which I'm gonna get into that more specifically later. But I think this unique kind of drop change overall is actually really good. The only exception, and I don't know if this is the case, it's hard to judge because of all the other loot drops, especially the like heavy magic find juicing stuff, where that's like a huge primary source of just overall generic loot drops. Because that's been hit so hard, in addition to uniques getting more rare, if it is the case that like the top rarity uniques, the like chase unique tiers like Mage Blood, were also nerfed baseline in their drop chances, I don't think that's a good thing. I hope that wasn't the case because those were already insanely rare, right? Like those insane rare ones, I don't think need to be any more rare. So hopefully that wasn't the case outside of just the other changes that are going to indirectly affect it. But if that did happen, then that would be my one thing where I would say the kind of less uniques dropping is not as good. But overall, that part's really good. Second thing is that vendor trash uniques topic I touched about earlier. Where, yeah. There's less uniques dropping, so you're not getting as many vendor trash uniques, so you're not getting as much currency. For most players, once you get a little bit into the league, once you get into like probably like red maps and high red maps, you stop really caring about this because you'll start getting currency drops more and you'll get enough stuff. But early on, it does matter a lot. But there's less uniques overall for like alchemies and stuff to roll maps with. So, and I doubt they buffed alchemy drops to compensate for that. I don't know if they necessarily intended, like even thought about the fact that this is also going to nerf alchemies for players because less uniques equals less uniques to vendor. But I mean that one would be an easy enough fix. Like you could just make more alchemies drop, but I think the better way would just to be to make uniques vendor for more, like more shards, whatever it is. So that, you know, when you find those ones and you vendor them, you're getting more to make up for the fact that you're not doing it as often. But it's a pretty minor thing overall. And then the last thing would be Divines, which I'm going to get into detail again right after this, but I just wanted to put in here that like I do really like the idea of using divine orbs to divine uniques being more costly in most cases. There's things like the timeless jewels that get like really screwy with it, and that probably would be a whole thing for another whole video that's going to be as long as this whole ramble is. But In general, I do like the idea of divining uniques being more costly because it makes the uniques dropping more impactful. But yeah. So getting right into the divines and exalts from that. I think overall to really see the full effect of what it's going to do on, especially the trade economies and kind of that as a whole, there's still a bit more time is needed. I think it's pretty clear, especially coming off of the last league, that if all you care about between exalts and divines is their ability to be used to benchcraft meta mods, that that seems to be nerfed. That you're not going to find as many divines this league as you found exalts last league or the league before. I can't say personally how much less, and I don't know, maybe I'm wrong because maybe I just haven't gotten that, random jackpot of divines yet that closes the gap. But that's the one thing that I think is pretty clear. But yeah, exalt's previous purpose, I really tried to think of like what else people are using exalts for the most part, but it really is basically just the bench crafts was what they were for. Like, because it's either the bench crafts or it's you slam items. And even when sometimes people would slam items with exalts, but even if you wanted to slam something, you usually just bought or farmed a Leo rank 3 bench in your syndicate because it was just cheaper or easier or whatever. So it's basically just the bench crafts, right? So that has now been transferred to the divine orbs, and it's weird. It's a weird situation. When it comes to actually using an exalt versus actually using a divine, I do, again, I like the idea of being able to actually use an exalt for what it does when I right click it and click it onto an item. Because it's not a thing that nobody ever did. You just didn't really do it with exalts. You did it with Leo benches. So being able to do that, it's cool. I like it. And then the thing of using a divine orb, like I said with the uniques, I'm fine with this being a more expensive thing and a more exclusive thing. But for uniques, the biggest thing of the divine and exalt change that I really do not agree with and really do not like is divining rare items. I don't know when, and honestly, maybe if at all, I'm going to actually use a divine orb on a rare item this league. And it's like, it's a tough one. Like, divining rares is kind of important when, especially in hardcore, when you're trying to min-max defensive stats on builds and you don't have like insane resources for everything. So that basically being all but deleted from the game, just I don't like. I really don't think that that was the way. If they had done this change with the exalts and divines, but kept some other way somewhere to specifically divine your rare items for, cheap, however that may be, just not the current divine costs of doing so, I would probably be pretty okay with the change overall. It would still be a little bit daunting because I think it's going to screw with the amount of access to meta mods, but that one thing in particular just really kills it for me at the moment. So, not a fan. And part of that's because of the next topic here, Harvest. The Harvest Divines just were deleted alongside some other ones. But Harvest. Harvest. There's the Life Force rework. I think most people, when they first heard the announcement of the Harvest rework and the whole Life Force thing, were excited. I was excited. The system as a way to manage your harvest crafts is better. Anytime you're not forced to like do the thing immediately, especially when it comes like crafting, has been really good. And like other kind of similar examples would be like the move from being forced to run your Alva temple to being able to itemize it and do it whenever. That's kind of what Harvest is right now. Instead of being forced to have your items ready to craft at all times, you can wait, you can stock up, and then you can use it all at once when you really have the thing you want. And one thing that was going to come with that I think most people expected was that, you know, overall you're going to get less crafts per harvest you do. I think that was kind of accepted. You weren't going to get as many reforges and stuff constantly, or reforges worth of life force. It was going to be less, because you have more control over it. Because there's ones that you just, no matter how much harvest you're doing, there's probably going to be ones that you don't care about or care about very little. So that was kind of an inevitable bit of it. But um, the other issues below kind of push it out of the way, and it's not really thought about as much right now. But the other good thing of the Life Force rework would be the incremental progress towards the rare crafts, which now instead of the rare crafts, they're just the expensive crafts. So the things like your fracture or synthesize, especially for solo self found, because you could buy a fracture before on trade, right? You could buy the fracture. You had to do some trust system stuff where you gave somebody your item and hoped they didn't just yoink it. But you could buy it. But for SSF, you had to find these just absurdly rare beasts. I played 3 characters to level 100 essentially. I had 2 at level 100 and 1 at like 99.7, and both of the hundreds I'd played quite a bit after. I played a lot. I found 1 or maybe 2. I forget if I found a second. 1 or 2 fractures that entire league. And I had harvest nodes the whole time. I spent, I think, about 5,000 chaos orbs on crafting harvest on my map device. I did an absurd amount of harvest and found 2 fractures. So this to me is very welcomed. The ability to like incrementally progress towards those rare crafts. That's good. And then the last thing here is when it specifically comes to the amount of life force that you get, I can't really honestly comment on it. I haven't done a lot of harvest. I had it blocked for a while. I only recently unblocked it because I needed to do some resist swaps. And I've only been doing it in like basic magic or sometimes rare maps, but I don't have any of the harvest nodes. It doesn't seem too bad though. The amount of life force dropped relative to the costs of the crafts with the most recent patch that lowered the craft cost seems pretty good. It actually seems quite good. But that's only for the crafts that are still in the game. Which is the big sore spot of the harvest rework. Yeah, removed or adjusted crafts. They removed the harvest chromes. The changed the socket colors, blah blah blah. My assumption here would be that they just didn't like that this basically invalidated the actual value and use of regular chromatic orbs for like high investment stuff of getting lots of off colors and like body armors. But I don't know. I'm not a fan of this one, and the reason I'm not a fan is because having to struggle to get the socket colors on your gear is not the kind of struggle that I want when I'm crafting items for my character. If I'm crafting an item and I'm trying to get the stats to upgrade, that's one thing. But when I'm trying to get the sockets to just use the skills to play my build, it feels like I'm getting gated out of playing my character. Whereas like with stats, I'm just getting gated out of improving my character. The like not being able to get your socket colors just feels like you're getting gated out of playing it. And I really don't like that. I have a similar issue with just kind of fusings in general, but that's a completely separate thing. That it's one of those things where when you get bad RNG from these, it feels way worse than if you get good RNG, and how much that feels good. And the harvest chromes went a huge way to combat that, because I mean they made it pretty trivial. They could have made the harvest chromes, a decent bit more expensive relative to how common they were in the old harvest, but getting rid of them outright was crazy. And then same thing with the harvest divines. I talked about it specifically. I feel like there needs to be a way to divine rare items in the game, so it doesn't have to be from harvest, but somewhere. And harvest was a way that had divines just for rares. Even if they got rid of the lucky part of the divines, even if they made them considerably more expensive relative to how rare they were, because they weren't actually that rare. They were actually a pretty common harvest craft. Just give me something. The other removed thing was jewel implicits, which again, I'm not a huge fan. They could have made these expensive. They kept the harvest weapon and body armor enchants, which are basically just free stats for the builds that want them. But they made them really expensive. They lowered it a bit, but they're still like pretty pricey. I feel like they could have done a similar thing with the jewel implicits. And especially the main one here is the ailment avoidance stuff and stun avoidance stuff. There was a lot of builds that relied on those to kind of min-max their character for that type of endgame stuff. And it being gone just kind of messes with the options available, the choices when it comes to making your character. Like something as an example is like the new Trickster. You know, aside from the fact that like CI isn't really meta right now because it's not in a great spot overall compared to other options. A huge problem with playing like a CI Trickster, which the Trickster rework actually has a lot of really good stuff if you were to play a CI Trickster, is it offers nothing to deal with stuns. The old Trickster had some stuff to deal with stuns where you were immune if you had a Ghost Shroud. Current one has nothing. And a good way previously to get that was to grind your harvest jewel implicits and get like 2 or 3 or 4 stun avoidance jewels. And then maybe a little bit on your tree or whatever, like somewhere else to finish it out. But that being gone is just, so now you just lost an option for, you know, an avenue of it, kind of customizing your character. And I thought the harvest jewel implicits were really cool. So sad to see them go. Same thing with key prefix suffix. Very sad to see those go. They were kind of the main tool for going after pretty heavily endgame items, where they basically gave you the save state on a piece of gear of either 3 prefixes or 3 suffixes. And depending on the items, it had very varying levels of power and value. But the fact that it was basically a save point at the halfway mark on an item, it was kind of in a lot of cases more than the halfway mark, because maybe you would just get 2 more mods and then benchcraft, and also the last one was free. I don't know. I liked having that kind of safety net because it did help with the like just incremental progress on creating an item. And it was like kind of the good side of deterministic crafting to me, because it wasn't too insane. They were really good, but they were also kind of a necessity. And you can do most of what the key prefix and keep suffix do still with like lock prefix or lock suffix and like scouring or something. With the obvious exception being a 6 mod item. And then there's some other cases, but really, really not a fan of those being gone. And then there's some adjusted crafts as well. The Reforge more likely was pretty early on reported to have been nerfed. The like chance of more likeliness to keep your same mods had gotten lowered. And then they did a patch where they said, oh, we accidentally swapped the more and less likely. So when I saw that, I said, oh, maybe they didn't actually nerf it and people were just accidentally using the wrong one because they got switched. But that patch has since gone through to fix it, and from what I've seen enough since then that it really does still seem like the more likely Reforge is indeed hit pretty hard. It's probably still usable, but I feel like I don't know that it needed to be adjusted. Maybe a little bit, but the amount that it seems to have been adjusted is pretty crazy. So, not too excited again. I mean, that's kind of the theme here. But the one thing I am excited for is the fracture harvest. Basically, we lost the 1 in 3 fractures and we lost the 1 in 5 fracture for a 1 in 4 fracture. It's a good compromise. I think it's in a really good spot cost-wise too on the current harvest, and it actually opens up some new stuff where you can use it to fracture jewels. I don't know if they intended for that. I would assume, hopefully, that they did realize that's going to be the case, because I don't know how much people use it in like trade league, software trade, but for like something like SSF, crafting a top end cluster jewel can be really, really costly. So I could see there being situations where somebody wants to fracture like a specific mod on a cluster jewel. Just having more options for like that is really cool. And the fracture harvest is probably the key highlight of something that's in a really good spot. But yeah, that's harvest. Next up, we've got the boogeyman, the undocumented changes. I'm not gonna go into this one too much probably, but what I'll say is I do think that in most cases, any changes being done to existing content or mechanics should be shared. And it's hard to say sometimes whether or not something didn't get shared because, you know, they actually didn't want to give us the information, or maybe they thought it wasn't important enough to give us the information, or maybe it was just an oversight, right? And just like an honest mistake, and they realized that they should have and they just didn't, right? And I don't know where a lot of the stuff this league lines up, but I do think that those things should be shared. I think things like you know, if they didn't want to show off every new unique item that's getting added in a league, that's cool. And then in certain situations, I don't think they need to give us the exact numbers. So like, one thing that was heavily assumed, but I don't think was confirmed by GGG anywhere pre-launch of the league, was with the unique rarity or with the unique item reworks to the like 100 or whatever uniques that they adjusted. It was pretty widely assumed that that meant the unique rarity tiers were going to be adjusted and some of the crazy ones were going to be more rare. I could be mistaken here, but from everything I saw, they never commented. And this is one of the ones where like they can be vague. I just wanted something like if they just said, you know, rarity tiers of certain uniques have been adjusted. That would have been fine enough for me. But then there's other cases like the tainted currency, the tainted fusings in particular, that they did actually talk about. It was documented, but it wasn't really conveyed what exactly happened. This is a situation where I feel like having the specific details, because this is a mechanic where we knew what it was before. It was 50-50. We knew the numbers. You either gained a socket or you lost a socket on your links, and it was 50-50 every time. We knew the specifics, so I feel like the change here should have included the specifics, and it didn't. And I'm sure there were people who, you know, might have even known that it was nerfed but didn't realize how much it was nerfed. From what I've seen, it's like a 1 in 4 or maybe 1 in 5, somewhere in that range, chance to add a socket link, and otherwise it removes it. And it's also not dependent on how many sockets are already linked. Like a lot of people thought it was going to be, oh, specifically getting from a 5 link to a 6 link is going to be really hard, but you know, maybe getting from a 4 link to a 5 link won't be as hard. It doesn't matter how many link sockets you have. It's still just a flat rate like it was before, but instead of being 50% chance of success, it's like 20 or something. I don't know the exact number. I don't want to throw out like that this is the number, but it's tough. And then the big one, the big undocumented change, which we got more information about today, was the past league loot mechanic stuff. And basically Chris just said, hey, I fucked up. We fucked up. This should have been, you know, documented and conveyed to you guys. So I don't really have as much to say about it anymore. But obviously, like, this should have been conveyed. And from the post today, it shouldn't have even been a change that made it into the patch at all. It wasn't ready. It clearly wasn't ready and tested through enough. But yeah, should have been documented. And then like the more likely, less likely harvest reforge. All we saw was that the wording ended up changing from like much more likely to more likely, which some people specifically used as like that was the proof that it was nerfed. But I mean, wording is important in PoE, but then sometimes it's not always the case that it matters. So that wasn't enough. Like that's the type of thing that should have been, I think, conveyed as well clearly in the patch notes ahead of time. All right, getting towards the bottom. The league mechanic itself, the lake. The lake is a league mechanic that I was excited for from the trailer. Looked cool, had a lot of promise. Honestly, still does, but I don't think that it's going to get to where it would have to be for me to really rate it highly at this point. And here's why. I mean, the rewards are okay. The rewards aren't insane. What's hard about the rewards for the lake is they're going to just automatically pretty much get compared to Sentinel because that's the most recent league and Sentinel was actually insane. The chests are pretty solid right now from what I've seen. Some of the basic chests are still like really, really unrewarding compared to others. But what I think should happen, and I think what still is going to happen and hasn't been buffed yet, is if at this point for the rewards, I don't think much needs to be done to the chests other than like I think the gem chest reward specifically is really whack and doesn't give too much, and there might be a couple others, but I think at this point the better play would just be to lean more heavily into the mirror thing, make more of those show up, make more players able to find the tile that lets you bring your own mirrored item in. Lean into the actual specific reward that the league has that you can't get elsewhere. Because if they do that, then, you know, people can compare the chests to heist all they want. But if the league actual special loot is more of an option, or not option, but reason to go farm it, then it adds a lot of value because you can't get that stuff elsewhere. And then the other thing is, in my experience, which I haven't done a ton of the lake, but I've done a little bit and I've watched other people do it a bunch, the mobs themselves in the lake don't seem to drop much of anything. Like, they drop very, very little loot, which I think is another way that it could be buffed at this point for rewards. And that'll also tie into the second bit, which is the actual gameplay of the lake. This is the main reason that I don't care for it a ton. I don't think the gameplay is that good. The little islands, like the concept is cool. The individual arenas, it's kind of that whole synthesis-esque thing where you're building your own mega map, whatever. But the mini arenas themselves are too restrictive on movement. I don't like. Basically, if it's a spot where I can't shield charge comfortably, it feels too claustrophobic, and the entire lake is like that. It's just really restrictive on movement. The areas are really small. I feel like they could be a bit larger in size and like more open to just allow for more, yeah, just better movement and not feeling so awkward to play in. Like there's spots where the mobs you can go from one island to another, and the mobs can't chase you because it's so narrow that the mobs don't fit. It's very weird. Also the islands themselves when you go to a new one, it doesn't need to be instant, but like I feel like the new ones could rise up a little bit quicker, or maybe you could make the mobs activated a little bit quicker, but that just kind of bullies melee because then the range mobs could attack them before the melee could just. I think the areas need to open up slightly faster. And then one other just random thought was like maybe having some sort of when you open the map while you're in the lake, having a mechanic to like click back to a section that you've already cleared, because there are like clear cut you've completed this thing or not, because that's like when the chest pops up or you killed the last mob on like a specific league one. If there's a way to like instant TP back to a section that you've done to help with downtime from backtracking, because a big part of the lake that makes it tough to justify, I think, for people is because it's anything that's out of maps has to be very, very rewarding loot wise for your time, because mapping is so valuable and it's like that core loop. Anything that pulls you out of it has to be really, really nuts, which is kind of why heist ended up where it is reward wise. But so something like this, like being able to TP back to prevent backtracking, makes you take less time out of your maps for the lakes, which ends up accomplishing mostly the same thing. Yeah. My big gripe with the lake, more so than the loot at this point, is that I just don't think the gameplay of it is that good. And then the final section, this is going to be the shortest one. Um, Minion stuff and kind of just general skill and build rebalances. I can't really talk about the minion stuff. I don't really play minion builds. They're not my thing. Um, yeah, they're not the. I will say the the core goal that they went with making items and gear matter more for minions sounds good. It's really hard to execute, because if suddenly these minion builds have to invest in more stats than other builds do. Most builds, basically your average build, you invest in your character's defense and your character's offense. On your this is like specifically on your gear. And for the most part, minion builds were they invest in their character's defense and their minions' offense. But now what it seems to be the case is happening is they have to invest in their character's defense and their minions' offense and their minions' defense. So they have an extra thing that they have to invest in on their gear, which is just going to make their gear harder to roll. And one thing I thought about was like maybe there should be some like hybrid stats on the minion pieces. So like when you get like a bone ring and you roll a minion res suffix, maybe that suffix should also just have a little bit of generic like play res. So like it could say, maybe the ring has like 20 all res for your minions. Maybe that same mod also has like 7 or 8 all res for you. So that would help combat the fact that you have to like invest in extra stats. Um but then the other thing about that kind of topic was just people have brought up a lot about like oh, melee didn't get buffed or so and so, like the skill's garbage and it didn't get anything or whatever it may be. I just wanted to point out and remind people that um, for the most part, when GGG does kind of the balance reworks for player skills and player build stuff, they usually focus on like a specific archetype of build, this case being minions. And there'll be like one or two, or maybe sometimes three, but usually like one or two specific types of builds that they focus on kind of, hopefully bringing up to the standard of current things. And it just lets them target in on all of the aspects of that specific type of build. So like minions, it lets if they're working on all the minion stuff at once, it's much more likely that each individual minion skill will be relatively, hopefully, balanced in relation to one another. So I think this gets kind of ignored a lot this current league, where like people act like they didn't do anything in terms of like buffing builds or whatever, because they clearly spent a lot of time on the minion stuff. There's a lot to the minion rework stuff that they did this league. It's just it might not have been very well executed. But yeah, that's kind of my whole thoughts on this league as a whole and all of the main changes. I The league's tough. It's not in a great spot, obviously, but I'm not gonna just doom and gloom it, and especially because of a lot of the things that have changed. Like, I do think a lot of the things that changed, their head was in the right place, and it's like the execution on these things just weren't done well, which just sucks because it means at least for this league we just have to deal with that, and hopefully, fingers crossed that like, you know, going forward they do get it to where a lot of us are hoping for certain mechanics to be. I don't think that they should just revert everything. I don't think that's the answer. And I mean, obviously, I don't think the like kind of just nonstop rage and just kind of toxicity towards the developers and like the people is the way to go about things. But that's all I got. If you made it to this point, if you made it all the way through the end of this hour long thing, then damn. Thanks for watching it. And that's all I got. See ya.